Cycle everyone. So before we started the show, I wanted to give a bit of context of the show in particular. So we recorded this episode a very, very long time ago, and unfortunately at that time we actually recorded for roughly 2 hours and we lost like half of the audio for technical reasons and also other reasons that it's probably not ideal to get into. However, at the same time, we did have the last hour and a bit of the episode, and I felt that the sort of stuff that we talked about in this particular episode, I feel that it's best to at least release it because there is a lot of benefit to be derived from it, especially with Abdullah Kunde, who has actually engaged in politics head on. So I felt that it's not ideal to just, shelve this episode. It's probably best to record it and derive benefit because there's a lot of insights to be taken from this particular episode. And so inshallah in the future I do hope we do a longer episode with Abdullah Kunde, but in regards to this I think there is a lot of benefits. So, and as well, during the episode we do talk about the Labour and Liberal Party, and for context for overseas listeners, those are Australian political parties, and at times they can be, they have parallels, or there can be parallels drawn from the Labour Party in Australia with the Democratic Party in America. Obviously, there's going to be, differences in policy making and all that, but I guess the essential objectives and goals at times, both parties have some parallels, just to have an idea of the sort of background of each political party. And the Liberal Party that we talk about, that is in Australia, parallels can be drawn from the Republican Party in America and also the Liberal Party in Australia. So they have some sort of parallels in terms of catering more to the rich, all that sort of stuff. So we actually talk about this on our episode, and I hope that you guys benefit from it. And also, before we get into the show, I also want to remind people of our Patreon page. So you can actually, once you donate $5 a month on patreon.com/boysinthecave, you can hop onto a $5 Patreon where we have many of our guests and listeners from all around the world in that chat talking about various different subjects. And, it's a good way and a great way to keep the conversation flowing from the sort of content that you hear on our podcast. So I hope you guys check that out and join us, and you can chat to all of us in there. And I think there's a lot of benefit to be derived in that way as well. And don't forget, you're also helping us continue this project in the way that we are. And inshallah, we can keep growing with your help and support. And if you can't do $5 a month, that's fine as well. And all we ask is your dua as well, so that we can keep continuing this and others can benefit from it. And at the same time, just putting it up on your social media, on your Instagram account, just putting it up as a story. Our podcasts, you can, let your friends know about us, and in that way, or make even a tweet or a Facebook post about a project, sharing our podcasts around on your social medias will also be a lot of help and benefit as well for us to grow. So thank you all for your support, and we'll get into the show now, inshallah. So take it easy.
Last 10 years is that they are willing to do anything to gain or regain power if they're out. So if there's a question about a very well-funded One Nation asking about some watering down of our current gun laws, and that giving them the extra 1%, 2% that they need in places like Queensland, guaranteeing them Senate votes, once we're all down in Parliament, of course they would give that. The famous quote from Tony Abbott after the 2010 election is, and, excuse the listeners the crassness, but the famous quote is, "I will do whatever to be PM except sell my ass." And if that doesn't frighten people with the Al Jazeera, investigation that was done, and then that's a single issue, the gun issue. I don't know what does. I think that there has to, because, what are the criticisms against the Labor Party typically from the Muslim community?
Even though the Muslim community overwhelmingly votes for the Labor Party.
Well, overwhelmingly, but I think that I think our most recent election was a bit of an exception.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was a bit of an exception. And, I just serendipitously happened to be handing out for Jason Clare in Blaxland at Bankstown High School or primary school, whichever one it was. I was visiting someone in the hospital there and, just came down to sort of hand out for a couple of hours. And I saw a lot of Muslims who went, and particularly younger ones, like ones, sort of in our age demographic, that went and grabbed the Liberal form. Now, I asked a few people about it, like, why was this happening? And,
why are there so many Uncle Toms around?
Yeah, well, not even from that perspective, but there was talk about, Bill Shorten wants to bring in safe schools. Well, no, he doesn't. He's the federal leader, and safe schools is a state-based thing.
State policy, yeah.
Talking about having unisex toilets and all this sort of stuff. It was actually, Malcolm Turnbull's office that had unisex toilets and, and so on. But there was, I don't know how to word it other than, homophobia. Like I almost think that, homophobia from within the Muslim community is the number one reason for arguing against the Labor Party. And, back in 2013, and funnily enough, this is part of the reason why I did the talk that I did that we spoke about earlier, there were a lot of Muslims who were saying, no, we can't vote Labor because Kevin Rudd has said in the first 100 days of a Labor government, legislate for marriage equality. Well, what were you voting for instead? You were voting for the torture of people on Manus and Nauru. You were voting for, austerity into the extreme, the destruction of our independent media agencies in SBS and ABC and so on.
Also, just in Australia in general, and this is like all of those sort of finite particulars when it comes to the political scene in Australia are important and they need to be discussed, and the Muslim community needs to be aware of them. But fundamentally, this is where I believe the great difference lies. The centre-right and right-wing of Australia do not have in mind an Australia that includes the three of us. I fundamentally believe that.
Maybe YouTube, but not
if you look, no, absolutely not, man. If you look,
well, not an Australia that's not stratified anyway.
No,
not an Australia that doesn't have us in our Western Sydney bubble and, never leaving it.
And how dare we, try and build mosques that are too big.
Yeah.
Or how dare we ask that we can play the adhan a couple of times a day even.
Yeah.
Who do you think are all the councils and who do you think are all the parties and who do you think the lobby group for these Islamophobic sort of ideas and this very sort of Anglo-centric ethno-state fascism, who do you think they gravitate towards? It's that old thing. It was a slogan that was rolling around under Fraser Anning's. I think it was a joke. But if you want a Muslim for a neighbor, vote Labor.
Mm.
And that's it. And it's because they have this idea that, it's not often. There are Islamophobic people within the Labor Party. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah. Probably. I mean, I haven't met any, but probably.
It's the idea that there is that kind of pluralistic vision for Australia that can encompass Muslim Australians and can encompass Muslims of various ethnic backgrounds that the Liberal Party has been traditionally very, very shaky on. And that's honestly, at the end of the day, if you want to vote for the Liberal Party on an idea like same-sex marriage, when half of their members are like Christensen is an outright enemy of Islam. He's an Abu Lahab of the modern day.
Yeah.
His entire life mission is anti-Islam.
Well, it's interesting that you touched on him because I think for me this is another one of the core differences. This isn't just a Muslim-specific thing. This is an Australian society thing, wider Western societies. The key difference between centre-left parties seeking government and centre-right parties seeking government is that centre-left parties need to earn the trust of the population. Almost the default expectation is that the centre-right blokes are just all going to be scumbags. That everybody inherently just believes that. They know that. So when there's, and I won't name them, for fear of getting boys in the cave, in media trouble, but, there have been multiple members of the Liberal National parties in the last couple of months, federal members, that have had issues with inappropriate claims, spending more time overseas than not. Our Prime Minister currently is on holiday in Hawaii.
Whilst the country's burning.
Right, well, half the country's burning, right? And, and that's the reason I'm coughing and, got this asthma at the moment. But the population accepts that. It's expected. It wouldn't be front page news. On the other side, whenever we do anything that seems out of order, that would be questioning trust, we immediately get flamed. And I think the fundamental reason for that is the guys on the right are saying, hey, how things are, or even better yet, how things were back in the 50s, that's what we're going to do. Like the way your life is now, at least you can guarantee it's basically going to stay that way. Whereas we're coming and presenting a different vision, at times scary vision. You know, like I was telling you guys about how, you know, lived and worked in a town last year, population of less than 5,000. You know, if you suddenly come to that town and say, oh, hey, you know, we're going to put a mosque here and we're going to put 400 Muslim families here and we're going to do this or do that. They would be, I think, especially given, you know, media of the last 10 years and 20 years or more, appropriately scared.
Some of them should know better, and some of them can't possibly know better. That's the thing you have to bear in mind when you.
But we've got to earn their trust in order to be able to have that conversation. You know, whereas you don't need trust to say the way it is just the way that we're going to crack on.
That's very interesting. Yeah. That's a very interesting insight there, and essentially, I think that the centre right has the benefit of media backing as well, and that's not a conspiracy. That is an outward, fact of the world at the moment, is that Rupert Murdoch controls most of the media. Rupert Murdoch is a supporter of centre-right and right-wing movements and governments. And you're absolutely right. You think, you talk about Donald Trump. I can't. The reason why I rejected Donald Trump fundamentally, I mean, there are hundreds of reasons, but the thing that I had issue with was that a man who speaks the way he does was allowed to become the most powerful, arguably one of the most powerful men in the world. Well,
who at the very least, let's be as generous to him as we can be. He at least clumsily encouraged the sexual assault of women during the election campaign.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Hillary Clinton has some inappropriate emails, unfit to be president, and as I said, it's exactly what I'm talking about, the trust versus we just expect them to be, scum issue.
And essentially, look, every Muslim needs to understand these things, especially living in the West, because that's just the way that politics works. And you need to understand the society that you live in. And we do live in this society. Most of our listeners who are Australian are born in Australia. Quite a few are migrants to Australia. But that being said, it doesn't make a difference really in the capacity to participate in the system, so long as you're a citizen, whether you're born here or not. So every Muslim needs to be aware of these things. And the old idea about homophobia being a justification. Well, I recall very clearly, it was on Sky News, Anthony Albanese being asked about same-sex marriage, and you know what he said? He said, I support same-sex marriage, which is true, which is no different from the stance of the last Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, before Scott Morrison, who was in the Liberal Party. He said, I support Anthony Albanese, but I 100% support the right of people who are against same-sex marriage upon religious grounds. And that's that kind of pluralism that I'm talking about, that tolerance and that understanding of tolerance is a very difficult word, a lot of problems with it. 100% there's a lot of problems with it. But the idea of having that Australia wherein there can be multiple identities and there can be multiple dissenting voices, but the understanding being that we each want access to fundamental, inalienable rights, for want of a better word.
And it's all about building that common life, aiming for a common good. And look, as a Muslim community, we've got a massive uphill battle. We've got the various, tabloid news programs constantly portraying us as welfare seekers. And
that's the least of our.
Oh well, of course, but this is particularly demonizing, right? Because it's essentially saying that Muslims are not reciprocal. We come here, and obviously not that we all, inverted commas, come here. Many of us are born here. In fact, I assume that there are far more Muslims born in Australia than the other way around. But the argument that we're not reciprocal is essentially trying to constantly push us into some other of society, and look, it's one of the reasons why I think engagement's critical. I know that we want to talk about some stuff that doesn't relate to politics in Australia. So I'll wrap up what I want to say very quickly by saying that I think the best example in the Labor Party for me of never being expected to vote against your religious standards and conscience for a Muslim is one of the New South Wales Parliament representatives, Sholkat Musselmain. He, not even in recent times, has ever been expected to vote with the party against something that he fundamentally disagrees with from a religious perspective and from his interpretation of it. He's never been held to an Islam that I would particularly hold to or whatever for himself, So a lot of people may know that recently abortion was decriminalised in New South Wales. We're one of the last territories actually to do that. Sholkat was not expected to vote with what the party position was that, that it should be decriminalised. Now, I can't remember whether he ended up voting for, and I'm pretty sure that he abstained or he voted against or something. I'm pretty sure that he didn't vote for the legislation. But the point is, I think you would really struggle to find a time where being engaged with, one of the centre-left parties, and obviously, my pitch is the Labor Party, but being involved with one of the centre-left parties really leads to these big, inverted commas, compromises, that people think that they do. Everyone's given the opportunity to say what they think. At Labor Party meetings, I've had to listen to members say that they think there's too many immigrants coming to an area. So it's not like every Labor supporter is, pro-immigration. I've had to listen to Labor Party members, talk about how, stamp duty for houses over $1 million is, inappropriate and we shouldn't have to pay it if they don't have to pay it under $600,000 and this sort of stuff, So there's plenty of people that want essentially, tax concessions for the wealthier end, of things as well. But that comes back to what I was saying at the start. When you're in the tent, when you're in the game, when you're engaged, you can contribute to these conversations. You can represent yourself, represent your morals, represent not necessarily our community, because I don't see myself as someone that's put up by the community. I see myself representing myself. But there's no contradiction in doing that. And if you really feel it, if you jump in, you really feel constantly that you're having to compromise and overcome your core beliefs to participate. Well, then I'd say, sure, remove yourself. But I honestly think that you would struggle to actually reach that end point.
Wouldn't you say, though, people make the argument that, Muslims are a minority, even if all Muslims vote for the rights for Muslims, like for the Labour Party, it won't make any difference anyway because we're such a minority. Yeah,
it's a very good argument, again, like put forward by, fascists to essentially divide organised communities. So like if we think, in Sydney, I think it's something like 50% of the Muslim community is in Jason Clare's seat of Blaxland. There's another significant portion in Ed Husick's seat, Chifley, which covers, Rudy Hill, Blacktown, those sorts of areas.
I think Tony Burke's seat has the highest proportion.
Tony Burke's would have a number.
He's very
as well.
popular though in the
absolutely is, and obviously he's coming to events often, to maintain that popularity. So I don't think the argument rings true where the Muslim community is actually concentrated, in these constituencies, because you got to think that, like, as I said, some of the safest seats in the country are 20%. Like 20% is a huge margin. And I've just named 3 seats where, to my knowledge, the Muslim population is around about 30, could be more. We're controlling the margin entirely. That is a huge, portion of the vote. To add to that, there have been Muslim community organisations over the past sort of 5-10 years, and you may be aware of them. I'm not going to name them again, because I don't want you guys to get in trouble, or me, but that have started engaging with the Liberal Party, and individuals in the Muslim community that have had quite strong engagement with the Liberal Party over the past 5-10 years. they're engaging with the Liberal Party and getting, a open access to government. Like to the extent, I'm talking about, meetings with Scott Morrison, meetings with Gladys Berejiklian, staff positions, in Office of Premier and Cabinet, Prime Minister and Cabinet, so on, massive grant, provision. And they're talking about changing the vote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%. Because that is substantial in the political game, and there is a bit of a game to it. It's one of the deficiencies of democracy, and we can read Plato on some of the other deficiencies of democracy. But I think this idea that the Muslim community is not sufficient enough to actually have a significant political say is ridiculous. And again, I don't want to seem like I'm putting you down, but the counter to that is, we talk about, the Israel lobby and all that sort of stuff. I'm not convinced that there necessarily is an Israel lobby per se, but if we conceive of that as a thing, and I think, again, most in the Muslim community would, well, the Jewish population in Australia is, I think, 50,000 or something like that. In Sydney it's 20,000 or less. That number in their entirety are not supportive of Israel, full stop. The number that are supportive of Israel are not supportive, certainly, of Netanyahu. There's a strong percentage of that. So there are, sort of massive divisions in that. And we're talking, therefore, about relatively small numbers, in the thousands of people that are, inverted commas, lobbying government. But they've clearly got a huge influence, in some regards. And so
the treasurer is also a Jewish man.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that he supports Israel. I don't actually know what his position is on Israel, but it's more a question of, well, if Jews represent less than 1% of the Australian population and Muslims are approaching 3% and probably will surpass it in the next census, why can there not be
exactly
a Muslim?
Yeah. And so that's the thing, like, as I said, we've got these conspiracy theories on one side that'll say, no, there's this strong lobby, we can't overcome it. It's a few thousand people. We've literally got 10, 20 times, that number of people. We certainly can overcome it. We've just got to get organised. That's the critical thing. And again, one of the tools, as I said, that are used by, right-wing groups, and it has been since, prior to World War I, are to divide organised communities. That's how they shore up their voting support in, places where there's voting democracies. It's how they make people live in fear. It's how they make people, remain isolated and insular and so on. And it's also, now how they make their echo chambers seem like the loudest, most significant voices. So yeah, I don't play into that thinking, but and just to touch quickly, in terms of, the Israel stuff, I think we've probably got to get a bit nuanced on it. It's how I prefer to be anyway. Like, I think that, when we say, phrases like, and I know language is difficult, Rafael, and it's something that you've spoken about previously, but when we say stuff like support Israel, well, that means different things to different people, I think if we want to say we support a place where, Jewish people can feel safe and secure, well, I think all Muslims would support that. And obviously, Muslims aren't going to support, the policies of someone like Benjamin Netanyahu, but anyway, we'll go on from there. We keep talking about politics, and I thought we were going to talk about other stuff.
I want to ask you a little bit about the significance of Islamophobia. Yeah. And, it's something that I've probably had the, alhamdulillah, like I haven't really had to face as much of in my life, either from my immediate family. Even though I could say that there are members of my immediate family who are Islamophobic, they tend to withhold me from even though they're aware of me being Muslim, they tend to say, oh, well, he's sort of different from them in some way, But how significant is Islamophobia in Australia and in the West? And is it something that you've encountered in your life? Is it something that you feel has really inhibited you? And is it something that is important? Because there are many different takes. Some say that it's really insignificant and that most of the issues and barriers facing the Muslim community are sort of imagined or due to our own lack of organization, for example. Or do you think that Islamophobia represents structural and social problems to them?
Well, I think it's a combination of both.
Yep.
I think for anyone to deny that there is institutional racism, structural racism, is like they're defying ample evidence. A bit of a plug for my wife. Her honours thesis was independent research project into employment prospects for people with names like Muhammad with overseas qualifications versus local qualifications and so on. And and her thesis has been published in a migrant, I think it was a migrant health journal. But she showed convincingly that qualifications don't really mean a lot, when your name is Muhammad. In fact, qualifications from Australia mean less, when that's your name. So there's certainly institutionalized racism. There's no doubt about that. And, one of the greatest proofs I think for this is that, the right-wing arguments against Islamophobia are puerile. Islam's not a race. It's not racism, or I'm not afraid of Muslims, I just don't like them, or like these puerile, language-based arguments that don't actually make any sense. They're obviously just trying to set up straw men, for the linguistically naive. But certainly, I think that there's more that we can do to combat it. I mean, has it affected me? Well, absolutely it has, and we spoke about, one of the incidents in which it has. Does it affect me as much as it affects people of colour, as much as it affects, people with less, European palatable names? Absolutely not, and I mean, I can comfortably sort of code switch, in professional setting between, Anglo-Saxon, country, Australian drawl accent, and so on. Someone that can't do that, no, they have it very difficult. And obviously, it's not just something that we have to deal with. It's, every other community that's seen as other in Australia, no doubt. But what can we do? Well, yeah, exactly as you said. I think we could be organised a lot better. I think realising the potential that we have for social change, I think it's going to be the great awakening for the Australian Muslim community.
What would you say that there's a lot of Muslim organisations, we know the Liberals are in power at the moment, and some Muslim organisations get funding from the government to run their institutions or organisations. So
back to politics.
What would you say in that situation as a Muslim? Do we actually be okay, yeah, maybe, do we accept the fact that perhaps they're giving us the funding so they can potentially use us as a to get votes, perhaps, in the sense of?
Well, I do think that there is a bit of a political game, as I said. But at the same time, I think that there should be perhaps different community groups or different community leaders, for different issues. I used to work for the Red Cross in Australia, and the Red Cross has, these sort of 8 fundamentals. Essentially, one is, being apolitical, so that they can work in places like, in the early stages of the civil war in Syria. They can work there. They don't comment about what the government's doing, don't comment about, chemical weapon use and all that sort of stuff, so that the government will allow them to work there. Obviously, they don't pass any comment about any of the other groups either, so the other groups will, let them work there. And then, obviously then the people on the ground that need food, water, support, benefit. I think that we probably do need to reach the point where the community organisations that are chasing funding, dependent upon government funding and all that sort of stuff, are separate from the community organisations that are representing our political interests. Or there are clearly demarcated individuals, committees, whatever, within these, larger organisations.
That are independent of the government.
That's right, yeah. I mean, obviously there's a conflict of interest, if you're getting, whether it be a Labor government or a Liberal government, if you're getting, a substantial amount of your organisation's operational funding, and then you want to represent a political interest that contradicts something that's being said by that government. You can't do that. There's obviously going to be a conflict of interest. So I think, that's the simple way for us to get around.
Because some Muslim academics will argue that you need to be, as Muslim communities, we should be detached from the government funding as much as possible because they propagate, CVE.
Because it'll be you scratch my back, I scratch yours, kind of.
So we should kind of build from the ground up, have our own kind of institutions that are, they kind of tie back to the idea of the West and what it's done, because it kind of ties into what you said earlier, like it's not like a monolith. But I guess the case is made is essentially colonialism occurred, and we want to and there's whiteness that got involved in the sense of white supremacy, and because of the institutional racism which you actually touched on, if we are like if they're like our lifeline when it comes to running community organizations, we'll never be able to truly move away from, I guess, whiteness within society. That Muhammad Ahmed will never won't get a job compared to, I don't know, Blake Smith.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I've been hearing this argument, like honestly, for literally 15 years, like maybe more now, and it would be more. Like from the first time that I had a disagreement in a shura meeting with Wasim Durehi, when he was brought to a Sumsa shura meeting, and I, gave him my opinion on what I thought he was doing to endanger the Muslim community in Australia and in Sydney. And I just think it may be true, but we're not progressing. There's been all this talk about building cooperatives and establishing, our own institutions. And I support all that, like I am very much about subsidiarity and, grassroots democracy, community building their own resources and owning those resources so that there's both trust and pride in those resources. You're not going to graffiti a bus stop if you know that, it's your family, your community that has put forward the money that's made that bus stop and made it something that's, special for all of you. It's a banal example, but you get the point that I'm making. And we've gone nowhere. Where we've gone in the last 15 years, in particular in Sydney, with the way that we'll just consider one issue, property prices. The Muslim community has lost billions of potential dollars, I reckon, in being slow to establish the financial cooperatives that we spoke about, so that people would be able to, in a Sharia compliant way, purchase their own home, get not just, consumption loans, but production loans for the establishment of halal businesses and so on. We have lost a huge amount, and of potential wealth there. That's wealth that could have set up aged care facilities, of which at the moment we've got one that I think is partially operational, one that's a massive hole in the ground. Yeah. And it's been a hole in the ground now for 5 years. Not Rahma, the other one. Yeah. And we need aged care facilities, I'm sure you guys have got your own experience, but I've seen it firsthand with family members. What's happening at the moment is like, I fear the punishment that we're going to receive for it, for what's happening to a lot of the elderly in our community with the structures that are currently
at the very
available.
least, it's a fard kifaya, isn't
Absolutely
it?
right. Absolutely
be
right. We could go through multiple other, community resources. Like in the last 15 years that I've been hearing this argument, there's been a few large mosques built in Sydney, most of which still have frequent, fundraising drives in which they raise, quite substantial sums of money. The Muslim community, in terms of its potential, has gone backwards, has lost, significant ground, such that, 15 years ago, I could have believed that we could establish these cooperatives and, have the financial and social capital required, to do it. Now I don't believe it. I honestly don't believe it. I think that we are dependent upon external charity, be that, taxpayer-funded subsidies from government or, non-Muslim.
Foreign investment as well
Absolutely.
from overseas places like Saudi Arabia or Turkey, the DNet operating their own mosques.
And I mean, and obviously, and then, the same arguments that can be applied against, getting Australian government or, state and territory government sources of funding can be applied in those regards as well.
In many ways, I'd say it's possibly more dangerous because when you have a mosque that's operating towards, especially in the Middle East, government lines in the Middle East, there can be some very, very problematic sort of political agendas pushed through those that are far more contradictory and far more harmful, I think, to the Muslim Ummah.
Without doubt. I mean, we can use, KSA as a prime example, right? Like, state-sanctioned murder, internationally recognised, known. And again, we talk about this monolithic West, America spearheading. Well, Trump did nothing. In fact, what was his glib comment? Oh, well, he said some frustrating things, and I think that, I think that the new Crown Prince is a good guy, or something like that.
I want to get a visa to do Hajj. So I can't say too much. One day I do want to go on Hajj, but obviously, look, I mean, they fund a great deal in the Muslim world, and they also lock up a lot of the great scholars of the Muslim world as well. I don't think there's a lot of doubt in that. Even within the sort of Salafi tradition, Sheikh Salman al-Oda is in jail. I think he's awaiting the death penalty. There's nothing religious or noble about this. This is a political agenda that is being propagated en masse in Australia and across the world that we should be very alarmed about in terms of our own consciousness as Muslims, and it is an injustice. I want to sort of shift a bit now to something that most of us in the community would know you for. The how would you say it? The scourge of Christianity in Australia. The YouTube
scourge, but
the YouTube sensation. Abdullah Kunde. Sorry, I was going to say, how did you get into? Were you sort of thrust into the position of? Oh,
look, honestly, just the truth is, fell into it. Unconsciously. I was involved with the MSAs at the time, and IAWs were a very student-driven thing. Yeah, we'd get the occasional sort of speaker externally, but IAWs by and large were a very student-driven thing. And somewhere along the line, I put my hand up to debate a representative from one of the Christian societies at Sydney Uni. Like, it was meant to be a student on student. And I can't remember how long it was before the debate, but like, it was certainly less than a month. They said, this student's pulled out. He doesn't really think he's up to it, but we've got this guy who is visiting at the time and would be pretty keen to do it. His name's James White. And obviously, like, I wasn't in the circuit at all, I didn't know anything, I had to Google his name and then I said, okay, it's obviously a bit of a big deal. And so I had a meeting with, I think it was the vice president of Sydney Uni at the time. And, said, look, I'm not really sure about this, I'm not really sure about a student, debating a scholar from their side. I think that I'd be setting us up to fail. And, the conclusion that we ended up reaching was that from the people who were speaking publicly at the time, there wasn't anyone else that we could immediately think of that was going to do any better a job. Our alternative was just to walk away from the event. They didn't want to do that. So I said, worst case, it doesn't go that well. We get to pitch it afterwards anyway as, well, it was a scholar versus a student. So how did you expect it to, pan out? And anyway, so I did that first debate, I think it was 2008 with James White. And it wasn't even really like a proper debate, and it was more of a dialogue really. Like, he, funnily enough, by their side, he hadn't been briefed particularly well on the discussion about the topic and all that. And I think he only landed in Sydney like the night before or something sort of before it, and, all that sort of stuff. So he was certainly, below his best, and it wasn't as structured as, the things that we've done since. But yeah, so that was the first thing. And yeah, like you're right, that a lot of people found a lot of value in it, which kind of surprised me and still does surprise me. So, when we were talking earlier about, people remembering, these talks and debates and whatnot that I've done. Well, I mean, aside from the one that I did a couple of months ago, I wouldn't expect anyone to remember anything, and
it's got a lot of hits on YouTube though.
Yeah. So
because I think James White, what he said in one of his, like, I think you did one of the best debates he's ever encountered.
Well,
I think
he's actually said that, and around the world, like he's presented at conferences in Germany, the UK, South Africa, Christian conferences and whatnot. And so he's repeated that multiple times.
And it's a bloke from the Central Coast of Australia.
Yeah, that's right.
who keeps James White awake at night. An MSA student from there.
Yeah. Well, the joke that I had was in the first debate, I wore a vest. What you probably can't see in the footage is that I was wearing like sand shoes. I was wearing like Chuck Taylor runners, and so the joke that I'd had, with my family at the time was, oh, well, like if this goes well, it's going to be, James White beaten by the young guy that was wearing sand shoes, yeah. So anyway, like, that first one sort of went well, and that's what sort of then led into, engagements with Samuel Green and a few others, like, because I think certainly the Australian community then, the Christian community, wanted to pick up, more dialogues. Like, there were a lot of people that were dissatisfied with what James did in that first debate, thought that they could do better, realise that when you're speaking in front of 100, 300, 500 people, it's actually not that easy. Yeah. I don't think that anyone has done as well as James, in multiple regards. People have tried sincerely, good on them, but I don't think they've done as well. But obviously, yeah, I mean, the debate that is, inverted commas, world famous, as ridiculous as that sounds to say, is the one that we did at UNSW. Then a couple of years after that, the question was, can God become a man? And I think that, this for Muslims, by and large, is a pretty difficult question to answer, because Christians, whether intentionally or unintentionally, will box Muslims into this corner of, but don't you believe God can do anything? How can you say God can't become a man or whatever? And of course, from an orthodox Al-Qaeda perspective, we've got a very simple answer. One that I could present in 20 minutes, and and I'm not particularly articulate and not particularly clever, but when you're sort of boxed into that corner and you haven't got the foundations of Al-Qaeda, you haven't got the foundations of Mantiq, it's very easy and say, oh, well, yeah, God can do anything. Oh, well, and then you get these, sort of...
It's kind of based on the ignorance, the doubts creep in. I feel that a lot of situations, even for me, like, you realize that there's certain things that you haven't known, but some people, how they approach the discussion, they think that they've already understood basic rationality, logic, and then engage in someone like, it sounds logical, but it's not really. Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, that's how doubts do creep in. It's just from people's ignorance. Even when I see arguments from atheists versus Muslims, and how Muslims have doubts in regards to God existing, it's literally of their own ignorance rather than actually, I guess, engaging with the subject area. I did want to ask a question that I know James White, I used to follow him quite intensely back in the day. He had this argument, and I think it's still a good argument, so I want to get your perspective, that he says that in the Quran, I think it's the Quran, I'm pretty sure it says for the Christians to follow their own laws or follow their book. It actually commands the Quran to, for the Christians to follow their own book in certain, in just ruling, I guess, in general. And what James White has proposed is that, look, if the Quran, why would the Quran, because there's this conception that the Bible's totally corrupted. So then when James White is telling a Muslim, hey, why is the Quran telling the Christians to follow a corrupted book? Like, is it truly corrupted? Is it not? So what's this contradiction happening?
Yeah, good question. I think in my experience, it's more Samuel Green that kind of pushes that line than James. And, his classic line is, well, you say you follow the prophets, you've got to read them and, and so on. And, this answer really, I could probably dedicate more time to than the whole political discussion that we've just had. But for me, I'll just summarize quickly. So there are essentially two schools of thought in Islam on this. There's the view that when we talk about, the tahrif of the texts, that the texts have been corrupted in their content. And then there's the view, and this has always been the minority view, although it's gaining some traction.
Dr. Ali Ataya in America.
He adheres to the minority view.
Very, very tough one to refute, I think, and not a great deal of work done to refute his view. I think he's very strong.
I'm.
You're with the majority?
Yeah, I completely disagree with him, and I think,
really?
I mean, I don't want to sound arrogant, but I think it can refute it quite comfortably.
I want to hear that. I want to hear your refutation.
So I think, the first problem that we end up with if we say that the texts are reliable, it's their interpretation that's the issue, is that we have to deal with the historical reality of how the Christian scriptures were collected. So the Christian scriptures, in terms of the corpus that we've got now, were first collected by a dualist, Marcion of Sinope. The second thing that we've got to deal with is the fact that there were all these other accounts. There were multiple other gospel accounts. There were epistles, from other purporting to be from other apostles and so on. That up until whatever it was, like sort of 60 years ago, 70 years ago, we weren't even 100% sure existed. Like we knew about the arguments that early church fathers, like Jerome and others, made against them, but we weren't sure that they actually existed in physical form. And, and then in the middle of, the desert in Egypt, we find the Nag Hammadi Codex, Nag Hammadi Library, and find, actually heaps of them existed, So I think that, they're, for me, they're the two big sort of historical challenges that one has to overcome to hold to that position. The practical religious challenge that they have to overcome is that I think holding to that the texts are reliable, it's their interpretation is wrong. I think, first of all, you need to be very, very generous with your interpretation of the New Testament Greek. Now, I'm not a scholar of New Testament Greek. I think that Ali Atai has studied Greek, so he'll certainly know more about that than me. Yes. But the second thing is, I think you end up boxing yourself into what is essentially the Ahmadi position around the crucifixion, which is the so-called swoon theory, that Jesus alayhi salam was crucified but didn't die. And
Dr. Ali Atai, I think, has made the point that it's just his soul that got raised, and that's how you interpret the Quranic.
Well, that's basically the Christian position.
Yeah,
but I think that's how his
gets
around.
His body physically disappeared
that,
too, but
the biblical interpretation that it's just his soul that got raised, so it's not conflicting with the Quranic ayah.
Well, and I get his argument, and I'm always welcoming of arguments that are trying to reconcile orthodoxy with other challenges, but I just think it's kind of redundant, to kind of go down that road. I mean, for me, I'd be agnostic about whether his view about soul being raised or physically being raised or whatever is true. I mean, I'll be honest, like for me, it's kind of irrelevant. Like it's not of particular interest. What is of interest are the texts as they exist today. Are they reliable? And it's just the interpretation that's wrong. Now, if they're reliable, there are some remarkable events, recorded in these texts that flagrantly contradict history. So, the first is one of the gospel accounts reports that when Jesus was resurrected, all of the graves in Jerusalem opened, and all of the dead came out of their graves, and they met and greeted people on the street. Now, if an event like this took place,
the Romans didn't think to write a single thing down.
Exactly right. Not just the Romans. Jerusalem was obviously part of the trading routes, coming from India, China, and so on. Nowhere else in history is this event recorded or even alluded to. Like that for me is just farcical. We could go from, sort of top to bottom on the specific contextual historical challenges. So, the idea, like, the gospel accounts are set up to find the empty tomb at the end, at the end of the story. it's the ultimate MacGuffin, right? So, like, the authors are clearly, they're trying to find a MacGuffin to justify finding an empty tomb, 3 days later. What do they do? Oh, we're going to go and, wash his body. Well, how many times do we bury someone, exhume them 3 days later, and then wash their body? We don't do that. Jews don't do that. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, once the grave's shut, like, that's it. End of story. I mean, you're certainly not going and doing the washing then on day 3 that you should have done on day 1 before you've put them in, right? So, yeah, like, I mean, for me, I respect Ali a lot. We've exchanged a couple of emails in the past, which you probably wouldn't even remember. I've obviously never met him in person, but I think that he's wrong. Having said that, he would obviously think that I'm wrong. And I tell people, I mean, in terms of our biblical studies, like, we come at it from different angles, like, when I was studying biblical studies at Sydney Uni, it was entirely Hebrew scripture stuff. Ali, as far as I know, has only done studies of the Christian scriptures, with that very, North American Christian academic slant. So it's kind of natural that we come to different conclusions, but I really think that he adopts sort of one position of strength in the argument, which is, well, the Quran says follow your text. We agree that this is your text. Like, that's a position of strength for sure. It's stronger than the position that I'm in, which is to say, well, I mean, I think that it's got some elements of truth in it, but it's not reliable. It's not representative of the original text. But I think that then he takes with that a lot of other weaknesses that perhaps either he hasn't considered himself or that he doesn't think are significant, but I think they are significant.
Well, inshallah, we'd love to have him on at some point.
Yeah,
and maybe,
probably debate between.
Yeah, maybe we can take him on.
I wanted to ask like 2 more questions. I know you have to wrap up. You have to head off soon. The quick one I do want to ask is about the resurrection. What's your kind of interpretation? Like, to give a quick summary from my understanding, for the listeners aren't too aware, is that the Bible says that Isa alayhi salam was, crucified essentially. But the Quran, the ayah explicitly says, like, he was raised up, so he wasn't crucified.
You crucified him.
So what's your take? And then there's the other element, I've had these engagements with Christians. It's like, oh, it's a historical fact. Everyone's witnessed him, and I don't know what the background to that is.
Yeah, well, if by everyone's witnessed you mean, the authors of the Christian scriptures, yeah, sure. And then sometimes they'll appeal to, sort of later historians like Josephus, It's
about a century after.
Yeah. But I mean, Josephus is ultimately, quoting what people are saying at the time. I mean, he's not saying that he believes.
So there's no real historical fact to
no.
people.
And this is why I come at it from a very different angle to Ali. Like, I think that if you can illustrate, which I think is very easy, that the Christian scriptures are ahistorical documents. They are not historically reliable. The narrative, therefore, is open to speculation. As I said, the Gospels are clearly set up to have this empty tomb, resurrection. It's almost like a Greek play, set up like a Greek tragedy. And for those that don't know, a MacGuffin is just a literary technique to justify the flow of a plot.
It's like plot armor.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I think that that's essentially what it does. I mean, the in the Quran is clear, he was not killed nor was he crucified, but it was made to appear that way.
So substitution theory?
Well, I don't know about substitution. I mean, I'm agnostic about that. This will be unsatisfying for people because I don't hold to a sort of strong view on it. The view that I hold to is that what the Quran says, that it appeared to people that he was crucified, but that he wasn't, and he wasn't killed, and that's it. That's all that I hold to. Now, their argument's going to be, oh, well, there's no historical evidence of that, blah, blah, blah. Well, there are some Gnostic texts that, essentially argue a similar line to what we say. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as I said, I don't think that what they've got is historical either. And therefore, I think it then flows then into what we can talk about. So we start from, and this is why I say to everyone, we start from the position of our fundamental aqidah. Okay, like, this is what we believe about God. This is what we believe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has informed us about himself. These are the reasons why an incarnation is not possible. These are the reasons why, we don't hold to these things. And then we can say we affirm the Quran as an historical corrector when it comes to these matters. The whole objective is to come and correct incorrect narratives in some of these stories, right? So, or part of the objective anyway. So, again, one of the challenges I think with saying that the Hebrew Christian scriptures as they are intact, and that's representative of the Torah and the Injil and so on, is that the Hebrew Christian scriptures portray the prophets as as scumbags, or to be that, right? Like they portray them as scumbags,
like Lut alayhi salam.
Yeah, it's very funny. I was reading a book. Harry Richardson wrote a book about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it circulates on a lot of the Islamophobic pages. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I'll check this out. And the first point that he makes is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is different from the other Anbiya because he was a warlord, and the others weren't military or political leaders. And I thought, that's not a very difficult claim to scrutinize at all. Like he hasn't read about Solomon, who was a political leader, or David, who was
about Moses. It was the first, political and military, leader of the Israelites. So, I think that it's important to recognize that, we do have fundamentally different beliefs, around that, and they emanate from the text, So, you got. You probably do know Rafael, but other listeners won't know that the Hebrew scriptures say that, David alayhi salam committed adultery, and intentionally committed adultery. Yeah. Now, we know, and this is why I start from the basis of our Aqidah. What are the attributes of the prophets? Well, they have to be worthy of following, and otherwise, why would God send them? What's the point?
How would you distinguish their truth?
That's exactly right.
I've actually had this dialogue with a Christian once, and one of the things they said is that, humans are flawed, so we can kind of reflect upon and correct our ways, and
So God made this flawed creation that He then chose to become a part of, that He had to, so that He could then forgive all of us, so that we can continue to be flawed. It makes a lot of sense.
It's like, we're just human. It's all about showing human.
Of course,
humanity.
Yeah, sure. Look, of course, making mistakes, committing sins, it's part of human nature. It can't be part of those that are exemplars for us. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, it gives us the opportunity for gratitude and humility. It takes a lot of ego crushing to be able to stand before, our God that we can't see, can't feel, can't hear, and say, I have done the wrong thing with this, and all I want is your forgiveness. I'm not talking to people about the fact that I've done this wrong thing. I don't care what, John and Mary down the road think about me because of it. I don't care about what my parents think about me because of it. I care about what you expect of me, and the potential that you have given me and what I can achieve. That's a far more profound message than, and I am lampooning it a bit, but it is a far more profound message than God knew we were crap, decided still to become one of us, the best one, still whipped people, then got whipped and tortured himself so that we could go on being crap. As I said, I'm lampooning it a bit, but I'm not,
that. I want to ask you though, just very quickly, just to maybe as a final point, what are the key differences? Because a lot of, as we point out, there is not the greatest deal of literacy amongst Muslims about the Old Testament and the sort of Christian variations of stories. Although, as I've brought up on other podcasts, there is a kind of somewhat alarming syncretism that occurs with some Muslims actually adopting Christian beliefs in theological matters. Particularly regarding the shaitan, believing that shaitan is a fallen angel. Muslims believing that. But the question I really specifically wanted to get to the crux of, original sin for Muslims. How is the difference? What is the key difference in the story of Adam alayhi salam in Christianity?
There are multiple, but again, we start with the sort of core Aqidah issue. So again, Adam alayhi salam is a prophet. Prophets are, as far as Ahlul Sunnah are concerned, are immune from sin. They're protected from sin. We believe that he made a mistake due to lack of knowledge. He didn't know that particular fruit, or whatever it's described as, depending on your source, was impermissible. But that, nonetheless, lack of knowledge is not an excuse, even in the modern day, like if you don't know that stealing from me is forbidden and you steal from me, well, it's still, a crime that you've committed against me. If you don't know that going 150 on the freeway is a crime, you're still going to get a fine. But so that's the first key difference, that we don't believe that it was this profound sin. And I think that there's an added problem with that for Christians anyway. The second thing for us is it was always the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we were going to leave the garden. And the proof of that is a conversation in the Quran that he has with the angels before he creates man. That he's creating man to put us on earth. Again, this is different to the Christian narrative, which is if we had have done the right thing from the beginning, we'd still be in the garden and would have never come to earth. So again, I think we correct, the mistake that they have. I guess, look, I'd say that the fundamental is, and I think that this is really poorly done by the masses in our community, in Sydney and Melbourne anyway, where I'm familiar with Canberra as well, is you've really got to have a solid grounding in orthodox Aqidah. You have to. If you don't, you get backed into these corners and you say things like the Mujassimin do, God could become a man, but it's just below him. What does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. That argument is languid in comparison to the volumes that people like Aquinas and Augustine have written justifying, the incarnation. So, yeah, I think it's, we were kind of touching on it before. I don't know if it was in the recording bit or when the sound wasn't working, but that you'd watched sort of lots of videos. The first person I've ever heard that watched my videos when they weren't a Muslim and then became Muslim. So that's encouraging for me. But yeah, and then you'd watched, some videos from a particular speaker, who's among the Mujassimin, and obviously, the theology of the Mujassimin predominate in the lay people at the moment because it's accessible and it's easy, because God's got a foot that's going to be in hell and cool it down for everyone, and he's got a shin and two right hands but without a how and all this sort of stuff. Well, again, I could just respond to that as a Christian and say, well, God became a man without a how. He was crucified without a how. He's a Trinity without a how. It doesn't mean anything. And obviously the scholars of orthodoxy, the luminaries of Aqidah, Imam Tahawi, Imam Abu Hanifa, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, and Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, and, so on and so on, rahimahullah. They argued against all this stuff, before the atoms that make up our bodies had probably even made its way to Earth. And they finished it, So it's kind of disappointing that in the modern day, it's, as I said, it's predominant among the laity. But I think, it's kind of interesting now that we've shifted from the political to the theological. But I think the way for us as a community to unlock our theological potential is to get everyone to go back to the beginning and to have a solid grounding in Orthodox Aqidah. And once you've got that, then you can go forward. And you can deal with challenges without even thinking about them. Stuff like, well, an atheist says, something can come from nothing, or, there can be an infinite regression of events or whatever. Well, no, they can't, and we've got basic orthodox arguments, that were composed nearly 1,500 years ago, in the earliest stages of, the Muslim community that refute that. I'm comfortable. You can have your view. I've got my view and I'm very, very comfortable and safe in it. And I think that that's the difference. We're talking about some speakers in the community and over time and how things have changed. I think that's the thing that I've tried to bring that I think other people in sort of my generation group have brought, that we're happy to listen to the other arguments, and genuinely listen, take them on board, have a think about them. How does this challenge what I believe? And then respond from the position that we believe in. Whereas I think if we don't have that orthodox grounding, and I don't want to call myself mature, I'm wearing a Gryffindor shirt for goodness sake, but if we don't have that orthodox grounding, we can never have that maturity, I believe. You can never properly engage. You're relying on the charisma of preachers. And I don't consider myself to be charismatic. I don't think there's a lot of, if any, Muslim speakers in the Australian community that are charismatic. And if we get to that lowest common denominator where we're relying on charisma, we are in a lot of trouble.
It's very true. I know we'll probably wrap up the episode there, but I do want to ask one final question, because we asked this question to all our guests that come on.
The most difficult question.
The most difficult question, yeah. We leave it to the end.
I've heard about this question.
You're prepared. Have you thought about it?
Yeah.
Oh, in the car on the way here, he's got a list and he's crossing out the names.
So, if there was 3 people in history that you could hang out with, past, present, excluding Sahaba and Rasul, because everyone's going to pick them.
Let's skip the obvious answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
And let's just, for Adab's sake, they're already in the cave chilling.
Okay.
But you can pick 3 people in history. It doesn't necessarily have to be Muslim, just someone that you can chat with, and who have perhaps been an influence on you.
Well, I think we've got sort of 2 themes. So I think I've got to pick like 2 separate days, and I'll actually go to a third visit to the cave, right? So, so my first one is honestly, my family, especially my kids. I mean, they, my son was our first child, and from day one, he has reminded me of the importance of being the best that I can be. It's a standard that I fail every day. Fail to reach every day, but I think that for me, would be the number one starting point. I'm so grateful to have that constant reminder, and subhanAllah, God obviously knew that I needed a daily, minutely, hourly reminder, to be a better person, but I'm so grateful to have received that. If we talk about the political side, one person I'd really like who has been dead for a while is an economist called Karl Polanyi. And Karl Polanyi wrote a book called The Great Transformation. It talks about a different sort of economics. It's not socialism. It's not capitalism. It talks about a different sort of economics. And Polanyi has this great line in The Great Transformation, which is that capitalism logically will reach the point at which all of humanity and all of the environment are just used to exhaustion for the purpose of generating money. And I think we're seeing that now. We're seeing that with the fires and all that sort of stuff. So Karl Polanyi, someone who I've met before but I always enjoy chats with, Lord Maurice Glassman, who's a Labor peer in the UK, and who has been very influential on my political thought. And I think also, because I never met him in person, from an Australian perspective, I'd really like to meet Gough Whitlam, because I think the position that Gough came from was sort of classical conservative, middle class and, all that sort of stuff. But he genuinely cared about providing healthcare, education, social provision to everyone. And I'd be interested to know more about that. The religious group, that's a tough one. I think it would be pretty hard, and I know that, other people, and this shows some of the similarities, between me and other people on the panel previously, but I think it'd be pretty hard to go past Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah. I think if you're a Hanafi, he's got to be in the list. I would say Imam al-Ghazali, but he is one of the few people, according to studies that have been done, that holds to the view that the Christian scriptures are currently reliable, that have been, misinterpreted in their interpretation, not in the wording. So I don't think I need to have a chat with him for that reason. No, probably someone like Imam al-Haddad. I think it would be incredible to sit with someone, blind, their whole life, but yet able to have a far more profound impact, on Islamic thinking than I could in, 10 lifetimes being able to see. I think I'd want to, as difficult as this would be, we'd have to arrange a curtain or something, but I'd want to get someone like Aisha radiallahu anha or Fatima radiallahu anha, and listen to the challenges in particular that they had in applying Islam in that early period, because I think that knowledge would be especially useful to, I've got a daughter, but also, to women in the modern day. But yeah, anyway, sorry, that's a really long answer, isn't it? That's the longest cave invitation ever. Yeah.
That was very insightful, mashallah. Jazakallah khair, Abdullah Kunde, for coming on Boys in the Cave.
It's a pleasure.
It was an honor meeting you in person. It was, you were the talked about man in town in the MSA scene. So it was really an honor. So I was never really, because I don't think I was at university then when you were really making the rounds within the MSA scene. So it was a good honor to meet you and have a discussion with you, inshallah. Other people benefit from the discussion, inshallah. So we'd love to have you back on as well.
And I wish you all the best with the initiatives that you're doing. Obviously I would have profound disagreements with a lot of people that have been on different issues, but I think it's great that you're providing a platform for different ideas getting out there. I'm sure a lot of the things that I've said today will be unpalatable to many, but the fact that the ideas are getting out there, I think is fantastic.
Yeah, so HT have crossed you out from the cave.
I think they did that a long time ago, but yeah. Honestly, Allah barak fikum. I think you're doing fantastic.
That's exactly why we started the initiative, to get different perspectives and ideas and really challenge the thinking of the Muslim community. So I think
that it's going to go out to America and we're going to get some very serious complaints about our gun control comments. I'm a bit worried about that. I can't go there. I can't go to Saudi Arabia. I'm in trouble now.
SubhanAllah. So I'll sign off there, inshallah. So for our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you have any questions or queries, feel free to email us at info@boysinthecave.com or find us on Facebook, and you can follow our journey through Instagram. Please leave a 5-star rating on iTunes, as that greatly helps us. Support us on Patreon. As you can see, the setup, inshallah, we're trying to make it professional for you guys, so you can support us and help us out on patreon.com/boysinthecave. So for my special guest, Abdullah Kunde, myself and Rafael, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum. I know we ran a bit.
No.